Namaste. You're listening to Shravana, the Rashtram podcast, and in this episode of Shravana, we bring you author Ami Ganatra discussing Bharat's unbroken Itihasa Purana tradition and her recently released book Mahabharata Unraveled, lesser known facets of a well known history, in conversation with Rashtram Accelerator Program learner Namrata Anantaram. Stay tuned.
Welcome everyone. Namaste, Amiji, to our Rashtram podcast, Shravana.
Thank you, Namrata.
We are very grateful to have you here discussing your book, Mahabharata Unraveled, lesser known facets of a well-known history. We are very grateful that you could come and share some of what you've written here, and we can be as readers, young readers of this great civilization, can explore ourselves and also our ancestors through your book. Thank you for coming today.
So glad. Thank you for having me, Namrata. Very excited to be on this platform, to be on the Rashtram platform, because I think what Rashtram is doing is something very, very interesting and amazing in the public sphere, in the education sphere. So congratulations to all of you for that. And yeah, very happy to be here. Looking forward to this chat.
Interestingly, Amiji, I read that you are, professionally, and you're a qualified management graduate and had a stellar career in that field. And some time back, you took up the path of what we call as the Indic knowledge sciences and also yoga. Being somewhat on the similar path, yes, the path is very far and it's a lifelong journey, so to speak. But I was very curious, what brought you to this? How did you take it up? I just wanted to understand, where are you coming from?
So Namrata, as they say that yoga finds you, Adhyatma finds you at the right time when it finds you without you doing much. In my case, it was a back injury. I had just finished my MBA and I was living away from home, not very happy with the way things were, and in that I broke my back. Now, when I broke my back, I couldn't do much else. But my mom has been into yoga for a long time. So she used to tell me, "Arey, yoga kar lo, do something, tumko aata hai," because I'd done gymnastics as a kid. So she was like, "Thoda sa kar lo, Surya Namaskar kar lo." And because I couldn't do much else, I said, "Chalo, let's give it a try." And I started loving it. So initially, it was all only about physical benefits. The back felt nice. But I just realized that there was some miracle happening. Because although everything else around me had stayed pretty much the same people, same situation, same surrounding, my response had changed. Probably I had become a little more patient. Probably I was beginning to appreciate things a lot more. There was a lot more gratitude. And without any effort, so to say, it was not as if I was sitting and thinking, "Oh, I will do my affirmations," or "Oh, I'll do my gratitude." Aisa kuch bhi nahi. It just started happening by my practice of the yoga pranayama that I had started for 6-7 months by then. So then I realized that the only change in life is yoga. So what is it? I need to understand better. And that's how I started taking up Patanjali Yoga Sutra, Bhagavad Gita. And then one thing led to another. Then I realized that to understand Indic knowledge systems, which is so much more than just physical health or even mental health, it's a holistic package that we have. To understand that, I will have to understand Sanskrit. The school may had some Sanskrit, but what I did realize is that the translations, especially the English ones, more often than not, do not do justice to the text themselves, especially if they're written by non-Indians. I can't even say that about Indians anymore, but especially when written by non-Indians, what happens is some of the cultural understanding is missed. Some of the cultural understanding which just comes very naturally to, say, people born in India, it is sometimes missing. So that's why then I picked up Sanskrit and started reading different texts and had read Mahabharata in 2017, 2018. And yeah, that's how the book happened. And I have to say, for the book especially, it happened because of the lockdown. So it's thanks to the lockdown. That it was a break. I had quit my job. I had come back, and the project just came up.
That's very interesting, and taking cue from how you mentioned that a lot of non-Indian authors are often not able to appreciate or even comprehend some of the dimensions of the layers of meaning that some of the words that Sanskrit has, and how it is essential that an Indian or someone who is actually rooted in the tradition dares to explore it for himself and also pass it on. I think that's something young Bharatiyas can take from this. To that extent, I also was curious. You started your book with the principle and the importance of dharma. I just wanted to understand what was the thinking, any special?
Yes, sure. So, Damrita, in our Indic knowledge systems, as you very well know, right, we have Shruti, Smriti. And we have a very clear categorization of different kinds of literature, different kinds of shastras that we have. Very clear. Shruti is one thing, Smriti is another. Within Smriti, we have the Dharma Shastras, we have Puran, we have Itihas, we have many other Shastras. Yeah, but Itihas, we have only two. Every book is not called Itihas. Only Mahabharata and Ramayana are called Itihas. Itihas means Itiha Asa. So it was, thus it happened, basically talking about something that had happened in the past. Now, unlike the general worldview, largely coming from the West, that Itihas or history is all about just chronicling the past. The way our Rishis approached Itihas was different. The way our Rishis approached Itihas was that everything that they tell us has to have a certain purpose, certain meaning in life. So what was that meaning? What was that purpose that our Itihas Rachayitas, Vyas Muni, Valmiki ji, what did they have in mind? Very clearly explained, Itihas, the definition is Dharma Artha Kama Mokshana Upadesha Samanvitam Purva Vrittam Kathayuktam Itihasam Prachakshate. Something that happened in the past, Purva Vrittam Kathayuktam, said in a way in a story format, so that it's easier for people to understand. It's easier for propagation because it used to be word of mouth. And what was the objective? Upadesha Samanvitam. It gave us a lesson. Lesson in what? The four Purushartha. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Basically, lesson for living our life. You see, understanding Shruti or Dharma Shastras by themselves becomes difficult. But when we see its application, we understand better. So that application of the wisdom of the Vedas comes through Itihas. Okay. Now, understanding what is Itihas is then very important for us to read our text. Now, the second step to that, what does it mean to say understanding of Dharma? For that matter, why is Mahabharata itself called the Dharma Yuddha? The war that took place, why is it called the Dharma Yuddha? Why isn't it just called World War, for example? Yeah, we had the World War. World wars are never called Dharma Yuddha. But this specific war was called the Dharma Yuddha, which had involvement from pretty much every single kingdom in Bharatvarsha, every single kingdom that existed in Bharatvarsha at that time. North, South, East, West, yeah, what we call Akhanda Bharat. From that entire people come in and participate in this war. Now, it is called Dharma Yuddha, but why Dharma Yuddha? So, for understanding why Dharma Yuddha, understanding of Dharma is important. Understanding of what the meaning itself means. A very simple way to understand is virtues and vices. This is Satya Bolo, this is a good thing to do, don't kill anybody, violence, ahimsa. All that is one aspect which makes it very simple for us to understand what to do, what not to do in life. But Dharma is actually a lot more than that. You see, every single person today has some kind of interaction with the society around them. Be it related to family, be it related to profession, be it related to friends, be it related to the country, all of that. Every single relation that we have entails some responsibilities and duties, some kartavya towards that relation that we have. Largely, the overarching principle that sort of deals with this kartavya that we have with the different relations is what is called dharma. And why dharma? Because dharma, the root word is dhri. Dharyate iti dharma. Yeah. Dharanat dharma iti ahu. That which upholds, that which sustains is dharma. Which then means every action, when seen in relation to sustainability, that will tell us whether it is dharmic or not dharmic. Extending it to Mahabharata, this war Was it required for overall sustainability of the society or not? That will determine whether this was a dharma yuddha or not, right? वैसे देखा जाए, so 2-3 generations of warriors were killed in this war.
Yeah.
Although the Pandavas were victorious, none of their kids survived. Not one, except Bhagwan, but largely whoever participated in the war, everybody died. Right?
Yes.
So from that perspective, so much killing, so much carnage has happened. Very easy way to say, it is bakwas, not needed. They created so much himsa. What's the point of this? But it is still called the Dharma Yuddha. Because had that war not happened, then what would have happened? We know why the war happened. That there was the Kaurava side were not willing to make any compromise, even though Pandavas were on the side of justice, right? They accepted the Vanvas, although it was a game that was a cheated game. Even then, they accepted the Vanvas. They did all that they could have done from their side to avoid the war. But then Duryodhana wouldn't agree. He was like, I will not even give the Pandavas a needle worth of land. Suchya agrehe bhume api aparityajya. Even so much, the needle worth of land, that is like the point of needle worth of land, I'm not ready to give away. Yeah. So when that happens, you are faced with a certain group which is sort of very, very unjust. Now, can you live with injustice? If that kind of precedent is set, it becomes like a Matsya Nyaya, right? The stronger, the more powerful, the one in authority will always oppress the one who are weaker than them. If this goes on, if this is allowed to go on, hence that cannot happen. The role of the king is to establish justice, to establish dharma, basically again to establish a system where every part of that system should be able to live, survive and thrive. And that is dharma. And hence this war had to happen, because otherwise a wrong precedent would have been set in the society. Anybody who has authority would end up oppressing the others. So for hence this is called the Dharma Yuddha. Now this is with relation to Mahabharata. Every single character in Mahabharata goes through this what we call Dharma Sankat or ethical dilemma. Right? And that ethical dilemma is what is basically the learning for all of us from Mahabharata. That what should you do? Arjuna is standing in the battlefield and he's thinking, how do I kill my own people? And it's a very fair point. He is very fair in asking that question. He is going to kill his own people. On the other side, there is a question of justice. What should he do? We have Bhishma. He knows he's on the side of adharma. He knows he's on the side of injustice. But he still can't do anything. Or rather, he chose to not do anything else because he had taken a vow, and for him that vow was the pivot of his life. Everything for him was around that one vow that he'd taken, the oath that he'd taken of celibacy and of protecting the kingdom, the throne of Hastinapur. So even though he knew he was on the wrong side, he ended up going with them because of the oath he had. So he also had a dharma sankata. Similarly, Dhritarashtra has a dharma sankata. Should he just keep pampering his kid, or should he behave like a king? So every single person, every action of theirs has to be seen from, when we analyze, it has to be seen from the prism of dharma, from the prism of sustainability. How sustainable, how long-term impact, what kind of long-term impact was that action or was that decision going to have? And only when we understand what is dharma will we be able to analyze and view the happenings in Mahabharata in the right light. Otherwise, it's like, what I was told by some people that, at the end of the day, Mahabharata was only a war of cousins, yeah? It was just a war of egos, and somebody like Krishna came and stoked the egos of the Pandavas and the war happened. So it is not that. That is not the purpose of this war. And if we understand Mahabharata like this, just a fratricidal war, where people were just, their egos just came in and Krishna stoked their egos, then the point of Mahabharata is lost. Hence, I gave a very long answer to your question, but hence understanding dharma was important to understand Mahabharata, and hence I started with what is dharma as the first introductory chapter. Sorry for the long answer.
I think this context setting is what is often missed in a lot of retellings of this epic. As you rightly pointed out, it is very important for us to ground ourselves in dharma and view each and every story and each and every dimension of life from this lens, so to speak, because Without that, there could be a lot of distortions and a lot of extremes of viewpoints. Thank you for clarifying that and sharing your insights on that. You mentioned about Bhishma's Dharma Sankata, but I'm also sort of called to understand. In one of your chapters, you call it Dharma meets strength. You make a careful analysis of Yudhishthira's leadership style, right? It is one which involves extensive consultation of scholars and scriptures and a very thorough attempt at consensus building, right? You also mentioned how the Pandavas were largely agreeable with this approach, except during maybe the Dyut Krida when Bhima is extremely furious with Yudhishthira and because he waged Panchali and all of that went south. So in this context, I wanted to understand from a dharmic lens, what is your take on excessive consultation in leaders? I mean, when leaders take up excessive consultations to the extent that they are often blind to something which is apparent and obvious, and also the inability to deal with positions of strength. That is, a sort of power equation. That is, Pandavas were unable to stand up to Yudhishthira despite, obviously knowing that what he was, standing for may not be dharma, but it is their innate inability to deal with powers or strength. So I just wanted to understand, how do you look at this from a dharmic lens?
One, the excessive consultation part. I think what Yudhishthir did was actually not excessive consultation. Yeah, eventually he did what he had to do. But just from a dharmic lens of excessive consultation, I think even Bhishma, or it comes many times in Mahabharata, there are a lot of these discourses about the Raj Dharma. What the Shastras say is that a king shouldn't take decisions all by himself. Okay, that is wrong. He should not also take decisions asking each and everybody. No, even that doesn't help. He should consult those 2-3 people, those important people who have stakeholders, who are the key stakeholders and who are learned and experts in their field. So if a discussion is done that way with people who really know that subject, then that discussion will yield you good. So that is why also there is huge stress on how do you appoint ministers. Both in Mahabharata and Ramayana, there are discourses around how should you appoint ministers, because essentially your discussions will be along with those people who are going to with your ministers. Yeah. So what Yudhishthir did was not necessarily excessive consultation. Shastras are very clear about too many cooks spoil the broth. This comes from our Shastras as well. So that shouldn't happen. You should only involve the ones who are really important and learned. About Yudhishthir. So Yudhishthir sought everybody's opinion, but he had his own mind. He took his own decisions, taking everybody's input into account. We also have to understand that, especially when it came to the question of war after the 13 years of Vanvas, after that, he always knew the war is going to happen. That is why he sends Arjun to get the celestial weapons, the Divyastra. That is why he sends Arjun away to Indra, right? So he knows the war is going to happen. But the war, he cannot fight by himself. He needs allies for that. Now the allies need to feel important as well, right? Hence, when it comes to making a decision for the war, they all have to be involved. They all have to feel that they are equally part to this war and it is not just Yudhishthir's war. So there, involving again all stakeholders is very important, and that he did. Now, when it comes to the Dyut Krida episode, Nakul Sahadev don't say anything. Bhim, of course, expresses his anger and his disapproval of what was done to Draupadi. When pushed too much, even Arjun speaks about that. Even Arjun says that no, she cannot be, because Yudhishthir had already staked and lost us, and he had already staked and lost himself. He cannot stake Draupadi and she is not a Dasi. Arjun very categorically states that as well. Yeah. But in that situation, you see, he was not, Yudhishthir was not in a position of decision making. His buddhi had become Bhramit. And he says that when during Vanvas, Bhim keeps pushing him that we have to go and fight. What you did was wrong. Because of you, we are having to deal with all this, live in Vanvas, vagere, vagere. Yudhishthir says very clearly that I know what I did was wrong. I know that my buddhi had become Bhramit because I don't know, because I was hoping that maybe this one dao, this one stake might save all of us. Okay. So hence I kept taking, I was not sure what I was doing. I was just trying to salvage what was going out of my hand. So that was not really decision making. That was that period when the buddhi, which the lesson for us is it can happen to anybody. The strongest, the people who have the strongest of mind. If you are too much, if you get addicted to something, if you want to, you reach that stage where you are drowning and you will also hold on to a straw. That is what Yudhishthira was doing. Now the other way, it's a hypothetical situation. Had Yudhishthir not staked Draupadi, what would have happened? Would Draupadi be free? No, she would still have had Dasi status only, right? Because if Draupadi would not have come, the Youth Krida Bhavan, if all this drama hadn't happened and whatever happened to her was absolutely nerve-wrenching, absolutely filthy, it was like the lowest point of the entire Mahabharata, right? If that would not have happened, then the Pandavas would have never got their kingdoms or anything back. They would have become slaves of Duryodhana and everybody for life. Now, what do some people say? That but the five Pandavas were very capable. They would have gone and defeated the Duryodhana, would have defeated Kauravas. No, even that wouldn't have happened because all their astra shastras were taken away. Were they going to stand there and fight the entire Kaurav Sabha with their hands? We have to remember that the army and everything was on the side of Kauravas at that time. Yeah, so they were in that very, very helpless situation where anything they would have said wouldn't have helped at all. And Arjun makes a very interesting point there. So when Bhim becomes upset and he's screaming at Yudhishthir for taking this wrong decision and putting all of them in such a state, which was, his anger was justified. But Arjun says that don't fall to this trick because the Kauravas are trying to break us. If we break, then that's it. If five of us today, we are together, we are united, and that is our strength. But if we break and we fight against each other and we try to stand up in this situation, then it is a fall of all of us. And he was right. It was not as if the Pandavas didn't tell Duryodhana anything, didn't tell Yudhishthira anything. They always did. If you see that whole Vanaparva, not just Bhim, but even Draupadi gives so many advice to Yudhishthira. And it comes in that chapter of the marriage that night. Every now and then, Draupadi also reminds him what his work should be, that he shouldn't just be sitting and doing tapasya, he should be working, he should be thinking about how to fight, he should not give up his kingdom, he should always think about how to get his kingdom back. Yeah. So it is not as if nobody spoke to him or nobody spoke to power or anything like that. It was just that momentary lapse of judgment on Yudhishthir's part, which was really not correct, not justifying that. But it does not translate to people not speaking up to power or excessive consultation is my point here. Does that answer your question? Does it?
Yes, definitely. It does. I mean, and also the general theme, right, in some of our epics, I believe, is that nobody is portrayed to be, absolutely faultless and speckless. And it is precisely for this reason that some of these things are told to us, so that we can maneuver and acknowledge that there can be these lapses, and what we need to do thereafter and what we need to learn from that is basically what defines us and also the context. So yes, I take your point.
What you're saying is bang on, Namrata, right? It's not as if people don't make mistakes in life. People make mistakes in life. But how they deal with those mistakes is what determines their character. And that is why Yudhishthir says again and again, what I did was a mistake. And hence, I must live those 13 years of Vanvas. Every now and then, Bhim will say, 13 years is equal to 13 days. Sometimes 13 years is equal to 13 months. So let's go and fight. Yudhishthir says, no, I will not do that. Because one, I need to do the tapasya for whatever happened. But on the practical side, we don't even have the strength to go and fight right now. With us gone, and see, the other thing is they had just finished the Rajasuya Yagna. Yeah. Now, what happens in the Rajasuya Yagna? You have to go and get every kingdom of Bharatvarsh to accept that you are the Chakravarti king. Okay. Now, not everybody would have done it very happily, right? Some of them also fought against the four brothers when they went to get to show them that okay, you should agree Yudhishthir's service, you should agree his allegiance. Not everybody did it happily. So now all of those kings are also going to be with Duryodhana when they have a chance, right? So they did not even have strength, whereas Duryodhana was becoming more and more powerful, getting all these friends and stuff like that. So just fighting के लिए fight कर दो wouldn't have made sense. They needed to have people who support them. They needed to have army. They needed to have weapons. So planning that was also very important, and that is what Yudhishthir did in the 13 years. So I think from Yudhishthir's character, what we have to learn is that immediate gratification doesn't always work. Impulsive reactions don't always work. In fact, his impulsive reaction of staking, we know where it led him, right? But once that was done, he cannot keep committing the same mistake by trying to gratify or get back what he'd lost immediately. Sometimes you just have to wait. You have to give it time. You have to have patience. Whatever decision you take has to be thought through. And that is what he did afterwards. That's how he behaved before also. That's what he did afterwards as well. It's just that what this incident shows us, as you rightly said, that it's possible even with somebody, for somebody like Yudhishthir to commit such a mistake in such a situation, or what addiction can lead you to, or what this position of gambling or any such vice can lead you to, such addiction can lead you to. So yeah, but the character comes out of what you do after that has happened and how you get yourself out of it.
Absolutely. And in that, I think the Pandavas are largely also, because they are somewhere devoted to the cause of dharma at the end of the day. Yes, they do have their set of flaws, but they are largely devoted to the cause of dharma. And most importantly, they are also guided by the Krishna within themselves and Krishna as their guru, so to speak. But so Krishna as a leader.
I'll begin at one point here, because you said something very, very nice. Yeah, you said they were guided by Krishna. Now, why were they guided by Krishna? It was not as if Krishna was always flattering them or telling them, "Oh, bahut acha kiya, keep it up." No. Krishna was also screaming at them when they were wrong, especially on Arjun. Yeah, he tells him something like, "Plebeian mas magama, don't be an impotent. What are you doing? Yeah, come and fight." Mm-hmm. Even afterwards, when there is this incident where Arjun is trying to, Arjun becomes very upset with Yudhishthir. At that time also Krishna says, "What are you doing? Morkhyat, baleneva." Like a kid, you had taken some decision before. Now morkhyat, out of stupidity, you're doing something like this. So Krishna also uses harsh words against all of them. Yeah, telling them, showing them what is wrong, what is right. But giving it to the Pandavas, they were very humble. Unlike Karna, who took every feedback, every criticism as negative and started bragging about it and fighting against it, Pandavas are very humble. When they are told something, they listen. When they are shown their flaws, they don't go out and fight. Even Yudhishthir, right? When he was telling him that what you did was wrong, it is you who has put us in this situation. Otherwise, with me and Arjun around, we would have never had to come to Vanvas. Even then, to his own brother, Yudhishthir is not saying, "Oh, shut up. Who are you to tell me?" No. He says, "No, I accept. You are right in telling me this. But now we have to behave XYZ, whatever." Yeah. So they are very humble, and humility is one of the key characteristics of Pandavas. That is why even in Gita, when Arjun is completely bhramit, when he's completely confounded, doesn't know what to do, what does he say eventually? "I am your Shishya. Shishyaste ham, Shagi mam tvam prapanne." I am your Shishya. I've come to you. I come surrender to you and you teach me. That is the humility that they have, where somebody like Arjun, who is one of the greatest warriors of that era and maybe every era of Bharatvarsha, he is saying, "I am your student. I am completely confused. You teach me. I surrender to you." That is the humility which also the Pandavas had, which the other side did not have.
Absolutely, and that's also a great character or a great ideal that should aspire for, the humility to surrender to a greater power, right? Yes, that's also something we can take that. I also wanted to understand, like, a lot has been spoken and a lot of discussion usually happens about Sri Ram as an ideal leader. But what are your thoughts on Sri Krishna as an ideal leader? What do you think of that? What do you make of that?
Krishna is called Yogeshwar. Yeah. And yes. Why it's called Yogeshwar? Because Yogeshwar is the Lord of Yoga, but that's one thing. What is yoga? In Patanjali Yoga Sutra, there is a sutra which says that when somebody achieves the state of yoga, when somebody achieves a certain state in the practice of yoga, what happens? Ritambhara tatra prajna. So the Ritambhara prajna, the kind of intellect is invoked in that person. What does that intellect mean? It's basically a strong intuition which tells you that this is the way to go. When anybody is faced with dharma sankata, you are between the devil and the deep sea, but which is still the better way to go? That intuition is very strong in some people, especially people who have a very yogastha buddhi, who have very calm mind, very focused mind. So Krishna is that kind of a person who has no confusion in his head about what should be done, when it should be done, how it should be done. He is not bound himself in shackles of "Arey, log kya kahenge? Arey, what is this right to do? Is it wrong to do?" Of course, right and wrong matter to him for sure, but he knows that at that point in time, what is the right action. And I'll give you just one example, or rather, one example where he shows very different behavior, and in spite, he shows different behavior. So maybe I talk about the examples first, and then we'll do the analysis. When Arjun is standing there to fight, or rather he's in Kurukshetra and he's like, oh, how do I fight my own people? So he tells him, Hatova prapsasi swarga jitva bhokshase mahin. If you get killed in the war, you will still enjoy the swarga. And if you win, then you will enjoy the luxury of this entire earth. You will become the ruler of this entire earth. So hence you should fight. Only in fighting you have kirti. Right? So that is your swadharma. You must fight. If you don't fight, then you will get... people will criticize you, they'll talk bad about you and stuff like that. He says that and he makes Arjun fight. Now look at what Krishna did when Jarasandha, so when after killing Kans, Krishna was in Mathura and stuff, and Jarasandha attacked them some multiple times, right? Some again and again Jarasandha would come and attack Mathura. So initially they fought, but eventually what Krishna said? That okay, great, very good. Now I will go from here. I will run away. I will run away to Dwarka, set up a different city altogether. I don't want to be in Mathura. I don't want to deal with Jarasandha. Now for that, even today, he's called Ranchhod Rai. Ranchhod is one who ran away. Now for a Kshatriya, to run away from a battlefield is actually a very bad thing. If you think of good and bad, it's a very bad thing, right? It is supposedly, it's very bad. It brings in a lot of akirti for a Kshatriya to run away. But he did. Because he's thinking that if I live, if I survive another day, then I can still attack a Jarasandha. And he did. And he did by way of Pandavas, right? During their Rajasuya Yagna, Bhim and Arjun. He was the one to suggest, let's go and first get this Jarasandha guy out of our way. Only then the Pandavas can also conduct the Rajasuya Yagna properly. So sometimes in life, you have to understand which is an exceptional situation, in which situation, what is good, what is bad. Not just have a very stark black and white, good and bad. Yeah. Now the other thing to understand that a lot of people say Krishna to hai, wo to kapti hai. He does what he wants to do. So he does not have any rules to follow. He breaks rules as and when he needs. Again, I think that is a very lazy understanding of Krishna, because that's not the case. Krishna is rooted in dharma. Dharma is dharyate iti dharma. He does not break rules for his own convenience. No, that's not the case. Yeah. If at all he has broken a rule, so to say, it is because that was the right, absolutely right thing to do at that time. Let's take another example. When he tells Arjun to kill Karna, or when he tells Bhim to kill Duryodhana, right? Now, you have all the rules of justice and right way and all that for people who also believe in those rules and regulations. If somebody does not believe in those rules and regulations, you cannot treat him with those same rules and regulations. So when Karna has fallen, Karna has come on the ground and he's like, oh, my wheel has gone in. So don't fight with me right now. Okay, he says, see, think about your dharma. It's very adharmic to fight. Now, already Karna is on the wrong side, because Arjun has stood on the ground so many times and he's fought the entire Pandava army. Even the Kurukshetra war, yeah. So Karna could have also very well fought at that time, but he became too tense or stressed or whatever, and he couldn't fight. Anyways, actually even he fought. He was also fighting, but at some point then he gave up. But that time Krishna tells him that what dharma are you talking about now? Where was your dharma when you kept provoking Duryodhana for this fight? Where was your dharma when Karna, you instigated Dushasan to bring Draupadi and disrobe her? So many people think Karna is this very bichara guy and anti-hero and whatever, yeah? But he's not. He is the one who actually tells Dushasan that remove her clothes. Yeah. If she's not listening, you pull it by force. He is the one who calls her prostitute. The Kulvadhu of Pandavas, of the Hastinapur Empire, is called prostitute by Karn. Nobody else has used this word bandhiki for Draupadi. So he says, where was your dharma then? Where was your dharma when 6 of you came together and killed Abhimanyu? That was just a couple of days before, right? That time nobody thought of dharma. So you go around, flout whatever rules and regulations you want. But when it comes to your own self, you want to be treated with those rules and regulations. Now that doesn't work. And in that, Namrata, there is a big lesson for all of us also, right? Because we know that the terrorists, they go out and kill whoever they want. They disrupt the entire society. But then when it comes to delivering justice to them, there are some of these confused lot who will say, oh, but they're human rights. Arey, human rights are for humans. Human rights are for people who believe in that dharma of humanity, not for those who don't.
Absolutely.
Right? So that is the other thing that we learn from Krishna, that basically through Krishna we learn what is dharma, and having a leader who understands this small nuances of good and bad, wise and virtue, of course they are important. But when is it right to take the path less traveled? When is it right to behave in a way where people might even curse you, put you names going forward, but you are willing to take that call nevertheless, where you're willing to take that infamy on your head nevertheless, because you believe that this is the right thing to do, and who doesn't mince words in leading his troops, in leading his mentors and mentees. He tells them when they are wrong, he tells them when they are right. So Krishna is that kind of a leader who's very yogastha, who understands dharma. So if you have a leader who has that clarity, it's the best thing one can ever aspire to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are also, a lot of, there's the section of so-called authors and mythologists, so to speak, who take freedom of writing and freedom of an imaginative narrative building to the next level, where there seems to be no boundary, or there seems to be no line between what the actual story is and what their imagination is, and what they want to do the limits that they would do to push their respective agenda through the epic. So I feel like your book is like so much more relevant than some of these other sections of society that you seem to distort what is, especially because a lot of people have so much of sahanubhuti for Karna and even Duryodhana sometimes. Yes, definitely he's a great Karna is a great warrior, and he's truly very much devoted to the cause of charity and all of that. But then I feel like at moments that are really defining and where decisions need to be taken, I really do not find that strength of character in him. And to that extent, I'm really grateful to authors such as yourself who have actually taken it, done a real understanding of the grounding principles, like such as dharma, to show us that yes, there can be imaginative stories, but here is what is, and don't push it beyond to weave your own narratives. So really grateful for that. Moving forward, you also touched upon Panchali in some of the earlier points. You mentioned Panchali and how she is basically an important role in the entire Dharma Yuddha, so to speak. But as a reader, there is this place where you've mentioned how basically there is this place where you mentioned the conversation between Panchali and Satyabhama.
Mm-hmm.
So Satyabhama asks Panchali, what is the secret of your successful marriage? How are the Pandavas always in adoration for you? And how do you keep them so close to you? How are you able to keep them under your control, so to speak? And the response that Panchali really gives it is more to do with companionship and less to do with control. A marriage is not a game of control; it's a bond of companionship, right? And that really stuck with me, because in our current 21st century context, where, ideas of equality and feminist rights and all of those narratives are building. This idea of companionship and, duty and devotion to one's husband, to the family, to the society, and to the nation and world is something very feminine. And it's so important that the females and each of us, not just the females actually, even males, how they own up to this inherent nourishing nature that exists within each of us without any sense of shame. So I wanted to understand, how do you believe that 21st century women can look up to her as an aspiration, or what are some of the ideas that you think that young women can take from her and her character?
Namrata, I also really like this conversation of Satyabhama Draupadi. I think it's one of the most beautiful parts of Mahabharata. Small part, but very, very interesting. Because it tells us multiple things, yeah? One is the narrative part, where people make it sound as if Panchali is just bichari, an object of misogyny and patriarchy and all of that, right? So just look at the question which Satyabhama asks. Satyabhama says, how are you keeping them in your control? How are they so much in your awe, right? How are they always doing your bidding? So, which also shows that Panchali was no bichari. Her husbands were completely into her, right? She could make them do what she wanted them to do. So one is that she was not bichari at all. So unlike what people make us believe. But the more important thing is where Panchali, Draupadi talks about her activities as the queen of Indraprastha. You spoke about companionship, you spoke about devotion, right? So what was it she did? Today we think that only aajkal people go out and work, and women work, and professionals and all of that. Okay, she was not going out. But if you read the description, all the activities she does, it's very clear that the whole palace administration is being taken care of by her completely, right? Apart from like giving out judgments on external activities and all of that, the managing of the entire palace, and for a palace like Indraprastha, where they had guests coming throughout, there were so many people who would keep coming. There were so many journeys which the Pandavas would take. There was treasury management to do. All that was completely under Draupadi. She was the one keeping a tab on that. She was the one managing that. In fact, she was the one holding all of that together. That is why the heading also I gave was the marriage that tied. Because first Kunti and then Draupadi, they have played the role of keeping the brothers, the entire family and the Pandav clan together, along with the kingdom. So, sometimes we think of only the fruits and flowers that you see on the trees, but we forget the root which is holding them together. Draupadi is that root. Kunti is that root. Even Kunti's character is very, very strong, which sometimes does not come out so well in the serials and stuff. Yeah. So, what is in it for women of today? One is that don't always think from rights. Of course, there are rights. Yeah, but there is an aspect of kartavya. You cannot demand rights without doing anything. And if you do something, do it well, do it with a sense of devotion and kartavya bhav. I think it's not just for women, it's for everybody. That is true for Pandavas as well. They treat Draupadi in a similar manner. Just because Draupadi is doing everything, they are not going out and oppressing her or exploiting her, right? So there shouldn't be an exploitative relation. I think feminism, the whole premise of feminism, when it started, was around exploitation. And maybe there was a point to it, right? Even today, I would not deny that exploitation, oppression does happen in parts of the society. But sometimes we take it a bit too far, and where we say, oh, no duties, nothing, don't talk about duties and kartavya, only rights. I want rights without doing anything. I want rights just because I've come into existence. I think that thought process, not just for women, it's not good for anybody. And that is the difference between dharma and the situation we see today. Because dharma always talks about your kartavya. The results will follow, but it is basically the kartavya. Your swadharma is your kartavya towards society, towards yourself, towards Dev, towards your parents, towards everyone else. Yeah. So, but today it's all become right-based. And that is where the dialogue has to change and come midway between duties, kartavya, and then of course the rights you have in a system. What should be your role in the system? What freedom should you have in the system? So I think that essentially is the premise of dharma, and that's where the dialogue needs to go, is what I think in the current context.
Absolutely. And an extension to the concept of marriage and, the right thing that needs to be done from moment to moment. You've also captured the concept of Niyoga and the types of marriages that are prescribed in the Shastras very categorically in the book. To many readers, this may come as a surprise, a civilization that seems to have provided for such levels of contingency, keeping the passage of progeny at its core, right, as the highest form of dharma. I just wanted to understand your perspective on this because, there is an apparent resentment. I mean, I wouldn't want to generalize, but, when I was younger and this entire concept was, I read it for the first time, there was some sort of resentment. Like I wasn't able to gulp it down so easily. But, as the mind slowly starts to mature and dharma slowly starts to unfold itself to us, some things start getting clearer. So yeah, I wanted to know your perspective on this and also on the importance or the impact of caste on the various types of marriages that have been prescribed and that you speak about.
My reading of Mahabharata or even Ramayana for that matter and the Shastras, whatever little I understand, to me it's very fascinating how accommodative and inclusive that society was. Yeah. Looking at it only in terms of being very rigid in terms of caste or patriarchy or misogyny, I think by using these terms, we actually are doing injustice to our past and our ancestors. They were actually very, very inclusive in a lot of ways. And you mentioned Niyog. So Niyog is a practice where if, say, a couple cannot conceive or they cannot have a child. Now, that society was different. The reason a marriage would happen, for grahastha, for any grahastha who's a married couple, having a child was most important. Family started to ensure that they were kids because then you had to perpetuate, you had to ensure the continuity. Again, it goes back to the same thing as dharma, right? Continuity of what? Continuity of the society. How will the society continue if there are new people being born? If nobody is having kids, then nobody will be born. So hence having a kid, having a progeny was the basis of a grahastha ashram as well. One of the key duties of a household. Now, if there is a couple which cannot have a child, what to do in that? Of course, people could adopt and stuff like that. That option was also there. But there was another option of niyog, which was also taken into practice in a situation where the husband thought that, okay, fine, the issue is because of me. I am not able to have a kid, but my wife is fit. So can I, in that case, get the service of somebody from my family? Because at that time, the lineage also mattered. So somebody in the family, some relative who I know is good, who I can trust, can I call him with the permission of my wife? This was not forced, yeah? So with the permission of the lady to come so that they consummate and a child is born. Now the father or the biological father actually then just vanishes. He has nothing to do with kids unless and until he's called again. The child is fully the child completely belongs to that couple. The child's father is also the father, is the actual husband of the lady. Yeah. So this was the concept. And this, as we see in Mahabharata, Dhritarashtra, Pandu, Vidur are born that way. Now, some people say, oh, how is it? How are the Ambalika and Ambika, how are the mothers of Dhritarashtra and Pandu, how are they made to sleep with another man? Okay, now the question is, would Ambika and Ambalika rather have a kid who they can live with or live for, or just live like vidwas all their life, right? So the point was that if they have kids who are going to be actually the royal inheritors, they were also going to, their status was also going to improve, their lives were also going to improve, right? So why not use this prescribed way given in the Dharma Shastras for such an exceptional situation, bring it to practice and have a kid? So in that sense, it was a lot more broad-minded. Think of it today. Yeah, think of it today. We'd be like, "Arey baap re, kya chal raha hai? Why is the kid so important?" and stuff like that. Whatever. So this kind of arrangements were made in the Shastra. Talking about marriages, there were 8 kinds of marriages prescribed, and we think love marriage is aaj ka thing, which is not true. Love marriage has been happening in Bharatvarsha forever. This epic is called Mahabharata. Bharat comes from Bharat. Bharat is born out of King Bharat, who is the ancestor of the Kauravas and Pandavas. He is born out of a love marriage. Love marriage of Dushyant and Shakuntala. Literally, like Dushyant goes one day to the forest, sees Shakuntala, falls for her, and he's like, Gandharvena Vivahena Mam Ehi. Come to me with Gandharva Vivah. Why? Because Vivaheshu Gandharva Vivaha Shrestha. Shresthatamaha. This is what he says, that Gandharva Vivah, where the girl and boy, they agree. Like, Mia Bibi Razi, to kya karega Kazi wala situation. If we both are fine and we accept each other, then nobody else should mind anything. That is the best kind of marriage. So let us both get married, or rather, let's just both consummate our wedding, and that's done. Out of that wedding, Bharat is born. Yeah. We have other examples as well. Look at Hidimba. She liked Bhim. She goes to Kunti and says, I want to live with your son. And I want a kid out of your son. Very clear. And nobody minds it. Hidimba gets the same respect in Mahabharata as anybody else. So does Ghatotkacha. He's always included. They wanted to stay with their tribe. That's a different thing. Same thing goes with Ulupi. So Arjun, when he's going on his 12-year Vanvas, he meets this lady called Ulupi, who's called a Nag Kanya. Ulupi sees Arjun and she just falls for him. She's like, you have to come to me. I desire you, you have to come to me. If you don't come to me, I'll die. Yeah. And through that night that they spent, another son, Iravan, is born. And these are all accepted given all the right status in the family. Nobody is called a bastard child or illegal child or anything like that. They are brought up in their own families and very well accepted in the society. Yeah. Also, just going back to, so this was more about the love marriages, which has been going on for so long. The going back to other kinds of marriage. So in the 8 kinds of marriages, there are some where the parents would themselves figure out matches, like we have the arranged marriage system right now. You look at the right guy, right girl, whatever. Then there are certain marriages where force might have been used as well, like the Rakshas Vivah and the Pishach Vivah. Now, the Shastras very clearly say that these should not happen. These are the worst kind of adhatamaha, the worst kind of marriages. However, they are still called as marriage. Why? Because the progeny who comes out of that marriage should not, as we call, a bastard child. No, he still should have his father's name. He's still a legal child of that father. Yeah, whoever that father is, however that wedding has happened. So there could have been situations like this, but you still need to include everybody who's born out of that kind of union. So in that sense, it was a much inclusive society than what we think of it right now, through systems put in. And these are systems approved and written in the Dharma Shastras as well, which are said ki apad dharma. So for exceptional situations, you can follow some of these systems. Yeah, so very fascinating, just reading. So that's the other thing about reading Mahabharata, Ramayana for what they are, that you get a peek into the society, which is actually different from the narrative that is pushed onto our heads through our history textbooks and through the ongoing narrative. So, yeah, very fascinating.
Yes. It also opens the mind to a lot more possibilities. And in that sense, it also builds for, allows for a better understanding of life itself. So I found that very valuable when I read in your book.
So people talk about misogyny and women not being empowered. You look at Hidimba, look at Ulupi, look at Draupadi, look at Kunti, all of them. They are themselves, the Ulupi, Hidimba are saying that, yeah, I like you. You have to satisfy my desires, right? Think of it today.
Yes.
Like people are fighting for that right today, that I should be able to do that. It was already there and nobody looks down upon those women. Even today, they are considered to be good women. People we can look up to and part of our history, part of our itihas.
Absolutely. So Amiji, we were discussing, and you've also captured some amazing pictures of your journey at Badrinath Dham and Vyas Gufa. I had the fortune of visiting some of these places back in 2019, right before the pandemic. It's such an exotic location. I mean, the entire Dham between the Nar and Narayan mountains and traces of the last remnants of the Saraswati river flowing through, and Keshav Prayag right there. I was at once taken back to my yatra when I read your book, when I read that part and saw some of your pictures. Do share your experience of the place and how did it inspire your book?
Well, frankly, when I was also doing Chardham in 2019, in June 2019. At that time, the book was nowhere in the picture. But as Krishna says, I have planned everything, nimitta matra bhava sabya sachi. So about the book, that's what I think. I can see Krishna, always murmuring in my ears. It's Nimitta Matra Bhavami. There's nothing else. It's planned. It's happening through you. So don't think you have done anything. I wanted it to be done, and you are just a Nimitta that's come in my hand. Maybe that is why all the things happened the way they did. Yeah. About the yatra itself, it was, what do I say? It's very, very fascinating. I have written a blog on my Chardham Yatra. It's on my Dharmo Rakshati Rakshitaha is my blog. I've captured my experiences from the Chardham Yatra. But Mana, where actually Vyasji, where they say that Vyasji sat and he wrote in the Gufa, he sat and composed Mahabharata in 3 years, and it was written by Ganeshji. So Ganesh Gufa is down, and Vyas Gufa is a little 100 meters above the Ganesh Gufa. When I went there, right, it was as if I was walking on the path where once upon a time the Pandavas had walked. And just that thought, I have no shabd for it. I have no words to express that. To be able to link it back to so many thousand years ago, that this is the place where they walked, and today, after so many years, I am walking the same path. I'm sure you felt the same when you were there. Yeah, it was quite something. I would say anybody and everybody, at least every Indian, every Hindu should definitely do the Chardham Yatra whenever he gets a chance. It's very cleansing. It brings life into perspective.
Yes, and also because it's at it's not so simple to reach there also. So it's almost like the process of reaching there kind of builds that resilience within you, because it's not so simple, because you need to travel for so many hours, and the weather is not so great. Yes. Yep.
No, absolutely. And I would suggest don't take the helicopter. Walk up. Go to Kedarnath. But then, of course, you go a long way, but still.
Yes, absolutely. Amiji, we also understand that you are an ardent student and practitioner of the Gita, Bhagavad Gita. So can readers expect a sequel to your book on the Gita?
Oh my God. I don't know. It's a huge task, and many scholars have written on Gita, but who knows? If Krishna willing, let's see what happens.
Yes. And any plans for any writing on Ramayana?
I definitely want to. Like, I think even within Mahabharata, in this book right now, I've not really captured the discourses so much. There are the whole Shanti Parva, Anushasan Parva. I've taken bits and pieces, but not really too much. So there I have an idea of probably bringing out the richness of the discourses. Then definitely Ramayana, because I think similar to Mahabharata, there is so much more in Ramayana than what people talk about. Yeah, people will talk about this one incident, two incidents, just the normal story and stuff. But why is Ram? And you get to see at every point the way he takes decisions. Again, every time he's faced with the Dharma Sankat. And at that Dharma Sankat, how does he find his way? And the explanations he gives for that are just fantabulous. Something that we need to know, but we don't. So again, Krishna willing, if I can, that's also something I would love to write on. So, keep all your wishes and blessings.
Yes, definitely. We will be eagerly waiting and hoping to see that. And we will also love to contribute to your research work and yagya, so to speak.
Oh, that would be fantastic, Namrata. Thank you so much.
It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you, Amiji. Wishing you all the very best and a grand success in your Jnana Yagya that you have embarked on. Dhanyavad for having this conversation with us. Thank you so much.
Bahut abhar. Thank you.
You've been listening to Shravana, the Rashtraam podcast. We hope that you enjoyed the conversation. Watch this space, subscribe to our channel, like it and share it with your family and friends, and comment on our content to let us know what you think. Follow Rashtraam on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Rashtraam SPL. Visit rashtraam.org for more.